So as Herta mentioned, I had the pleasure of being with you at ReSToRE a couple of weeks ago, and I was just so impressed by the conversations that we had and just the multiplicity of ideas that came up. And it sort of made me reflect a little bit on what had influenced my career. And when I first started working, I read a book that actually kind of changed my life. And it was called Our Common Future. And some of you may be familiar with this book. It introduced us to the concept of sustainable development, the definition that's still most widely used today, and also to another theme from ReStore, this idea of a just transition. And we really see the ideas that were introduced in Our Common Future in the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. This is the global agenda for change that was introduced in 2015. It built upon a previous project, the Millennium Development Goals, but there's a significant difference, and it's this. The Millennium Goals were endorsed by governments, as were the Sustainable Development Goals by 190 governments around the world. But the SDGs were also endorsed by business, industry, government, community leaders, development agencies. And that's because there was a recognition that these are wicked problems, problems that are too large for any one group to solve acting unilaterally or by themselves. We need collaborative partnerships. And so this agenda for change really focuses on this idea of collaboration. Now, collaboration in an ideal world, of course, seems relatively easy to achieve, but today's reality is a little bit different. The pictures on this slide come from protests in my home city of Vancouver, from India, and from Paris, but they could actually have come from any country or city around the world, because we are seeing increasing incidences of public concern of projects that once upon a time might have been easily approved, now are questioned by the public. And there's a number of different reasons for this sense of anger and frustration and low trust in institutions that once had an unquestioning permission from society. The idea of trust itself can sometimes be contested, and there's always lots of debate about how we measure trust. But in this article from 1995, it talks about how trust is built upon three pillars: ability, which we could also call competence, benevolence, and integrity. And I think what we often see are problems related to benevolence, the extent to which an organization is seen as acting in the best interests of society. For many companies around the world, including mining companies, and we'll come to that in a minute, the response for this declining trust has been programs of social responsibility, which often begin with philanthropy, sometimes move then into performance optimization, projects that offer benefits for the company in question, but also for the community, things like greenhouse gas reduction or the use of renewable energy or water conservation programs. But I think to really drive sustainable development, what we need to see is an extension of this spectrum of corporate social responsibility to include this idea of creating shared value. Now, the idea of creating shared value is not a new one, but the terminology was introduced by Harvard economists Michael Porter and Mark Kramer in a seminal article back in 2011 called Creating Shared Value. And what Porter and Kramer really talk about is that there is a significant opportunity for business and society to collaborate on points of intersection, things that business needs to be successful, at the same time, things that society needs, so that by working collaboratively, there could be a simultaneous advancement for both parties. It's a win-win solution in a sense. Now, philanthropy and performance optimization are important and valued. The thing is, those are mostly value redistribution ideas. And what we're really looking for with creating shared value is to build additional economic value. And here are some of the attributes. And I think that the three things that are most important is that these are projects that are co-defined, co-designed, and have co-decision making. And that makes them quite significantly different from past efforts at corporate social responsibility. To achieve something like shared value, we need to see some changes in society. And for that reason, I would like to say thank you and farewell to Milton Friedman. Now, to be fair, Milton Friedman won a Nobel Prize for Economics in 1973, so his work shouldn't be dismissed so lightly. However, he's perhaps best known for this comment that the one and only social responsibility of business is to use its resources and activities to increase its profit. So I think the time has come to say thank you and farewell to Milton Friedman, and hello and welcome to some scholars who are really focusing on the ways in which we can work collaboratively to advance sustainability. People like John Elkington, who's widely regarded as kind of a godfather of sustainability. Back in the 1990s, he introduced the idea of a triple bottom line, focusing on profit, of course, for business, because that's what business needs to be sustainable itself, but also on profit, planet, and people. A couple of years ago, I read Kate Wayworth's amazing book on donut economics. This idea that when we have economic development, we shouldn't exceed the planetary boundaries, and we shouldn't leave anybody in that hole where they don't have access to sufficient needs for their livelihoods, for their education, for their healthcare. Mariana Mazzucato, who works at the University College of London, has an amazing book on mission economy, this idea about how capitalism could be changed. And for case studies that really show how these ideas can be applied in the real world, Paul Pullman and Andrew Winston's book on how courageous companies thrive by giving more than they take is a brilliant read. And a couple of weeks ago, I was in a book club hosted by John Elkington that had the opportunity to talk to Ashat Rathi in his new book called Climate Capitalism, which again provides a series of really uplifting and inspirational stories of how we can work within the system to drive really systemic change. So I've been working in the mining sector for about 20 years, primarily in these areas of social responsibility. And over the years, I became increasingly interested in ideas about collaboration and how we might try to build a different model of engagement. The Michael Porter, Mark Kramer article that I referenced earlier, Creating Shared Value, really had a fundamental impact on my thinking about how we might work together with communities. Because there's no question, in the mining sector today, we face increasing scrutiny on the environmental, social, and governance aspects of our industry. And that scrutiny has also led to increasing incidences of mining company community conflict in countries around the world. This infographic came from a study that was produced at Harvard, University of Queensland, and with the American consultancy Shift. And it showed that for a mining company with a capital project of between $3 to $5 billion, the company was at risk of losing $20 million per week. That's in delayed production and net present value terms as a result of company community conflict. And of course, conflict isn't just costly for the company. The year that this study was published in 2014, Peru, once considered to be the most mining-friendly jurisdiction in the world, lost $57 billion in foreign direct investment as social unrest continued to cast a shadow over that country's extractive sector. And of course, it's also costly for communities, from the cost in terms of conflict to individuals, and also in the lost opportunity cost for driving sustainable development. So this has really led to the central question in my research, which is, can creating shared value in resource-rich regions build trust and advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? And I put the goals back up here for a moment just to point out how many points of intersection we can see between the mining sector and resource-rich host communities. For example, all communities need access to clean water and sanitation. That's SDG number 6. Mining companies use an awful lot of water. And there are already 2/3 of the world's large mines located in areas of water scarcity. This has the potential to trigger conflict. So we can see there's definitely a point of intersection. But companies also need an educated workforce. They need communities that surround them to have good health and well-being. They definitely need access to affordable and clean energy. Who doesn't want to see action on climate change? And so we can see that there are a number of places here where mining has very definitely had an adverse impact in creating the problems that the SDGs seek to address, but I think it's also relatively uniquely positioned to drive change on a number of these different goals. And if we were to focus more on the Sustainable Development Goals, it might open the door for a new model of engagement, where when mining companies go to communities, it's less about telling them about the mining project and more about exploring for these points of intersection. Now, of course, we're not going to go to a remote community and start talking about SDG number 6, but I did a project in the Gobi Desert in Mongolia a few years ago, and I can tell you, when I was out doing household visit with herder households in the Gobi, we had a lot of talk about water, about access to education, about decent work and economic growth. And so I think these theme areas represented by the SDGs really do represent a significant opportunity. So let's just look at a few of these goals, and let me share with you a few case studies that I think show that there is potential in this idea. So Ghana is one of the countries that carries a huge burden in terms of malaria. I think it's the 5th largest burden in the world. And what started to happen at AngloGold Ashanti's mines were significant numbers of employee absence from work due to malaria. Now, some people might say, well, malaria and health is a government responsibility and not a company responsibility. However, from the company's perspective, there was sound commercial consideration for taking action, as well as the desire to act out of care and compassion for their employees. And they didn't act alone. Together with the government, the local health authorities, and the company, a program was developed to help reduce incidences of malaria. When the program was first introduced, AngloGold Ashanti was losing about 7,000 worker days a month to malaria. And by the time this project had run for just 7 years, malaria incidences had been reduced by 75%. So I think that's a really interesting example on how companies and communities can work together for good health and well-being. I mentioned about clean water and sanitation and how 2/3 of the world's large mines are located in areas of water scarcity. The problem becomes even more significant when we think about the fact that the IPCC, the International Panel for Climate Change, predicted that by 2025, that's just next year, 55% of the world's population will live in areas classified as water stressed. So you can see that this competition for a scarce resource could be the potential trigger for conflict. And let's look at a couple of cases where companies have used the shared value approach to try to come to a more sustainable outcome. The first comes from the Limpopo region in South Africa, where the platinum companies operating in that region had encountered significant community opposition over concerns about water quality and quantity. Those 6 companies then partnered with the South African government and the local Department of Water and Sanitation to create an infrastructure project that will deliver a bulk raw water distribution network. Not only will it provide water to the communities and to the mining companies, but in the course of building the $1.7 billion project, a number of jobs will be created, helping to provide additional economic development in the communities. So I think that's a very interesting project. The second one comes out of that work that I talked about a few moments ago in Mongolia, where we were curious to see if a small company, a junior company, highly dependent on the equity markets for cash, might be able to create and shared value at a very early stage of their project development. So the company Erdene has a high-grade near-surface gold discovery in the Gobi region of Mongolia, in an area where mining, large-scale commercial mining, has never been conducted before. It is an area that nomadic herders have called home for centuries. So early in the process of trying to get to know their communities, Erdene discovered a couple of things. One, that they could work from a philanthropic perspective to help unblock wells that had been drilled during a previous era and had fallen into disrepair. They could work with local conservation agencies to unblock naturally occurring streams in the river for herds of wild camels and other animals to use. But perhaps most significantly, they asked the community about their water supply and discovered that the community had been built in an area of the Gobi Desert with no access to potable water. That water was being transported hundreds of kilometers across the Gobi Desert from the regional capital. There was no guarantee of success, but the company said to the community, we're going to do a hydrogeological survey to look for water for the prospective mine. We don't want to come 100 kilometers away from the site to your community to get that water, but we could include your community in our search. Maybe we'll find something. Luck was on their side. They did. They found a potable water source just 2 kilometers away from the town center. The community then used money from their community development agreement, and the company dedicated resources to help build a well just 2 kilometers away from the city. So a pretty significant improvement at a very low capital cost, but potentially a pretty high return in terms of reputation capital. The other 2 places of intersection for mining companies, and sometimes with SDG 6 itself, is SDG 9 for industry innovation and infrastructure. And the next project I want to talk about comes from the Arequipa region of Peru, where Cerro Verde, one of the world's large copper mines, sits just 30 kilometers outside the city of Arequipa, high in the Atacama Desert. Now, when operators of the mine began to consider plans to expand their mine, they were aware that several other large projects nearby had encountered significant community opposition over the potential competition for that scarce resource of water. So as they began their community consultation, they were open to hearing ideas from others. And very quickly, civil society groups and civic engineers asked if there was something that the company might be able to do to help address a critical social problem. At that time, 90% of the city's municipal waste was being discharged directly into the Rio Chile, which is the principal water source for the region. And downstream of where this picture with the river running red, downstream is a very rich agricultural region. Now, using treated municipal wastewater was something that was being done in other parts of the world, but had never been done in Peru. And following a period of consultation and engagement, it was decided that the company would build, operate, and then transfer the ownership of a municipal wastewater treatment facility. You can see the difference in the river. The picture on the other second side, the right side, was taken just 4 months after the wastewater treatment plant began its operations. The mine gets a portion of the treated wastewater for use in its expanded concentrator operations, and the remainder of that water is discharged back to the river, helping to improve its outcomes and clean it up a little bit. So there was an obvious benefit to the company. They got a source of water that's relatively drought resistant for use in their expanded operations. They didn't create any conflict with farmers because there was no competition for that municipal wastewater. But I think equally important for shared value initiatives is there needs to be a social benefit that's delivered as well. And I think in this case, that was pretty easy to model as well. There's now sewage treatment. Because the facility is being co-operated, there's capacity building. There's a scientific output of measurement at the discharge points in the river, which is helping with the river rehabilitation. There's a nice slide I could show at another time on the measurement of fecal chloroform counts, which decreased exponentially once the wastewater treatment plant began operations. And the company is also working with the community on water efficiency and conservation programs in that agricultural region of La Jolla that I mentioned previously. Decent work and economic growth is also an area that mining companies often like to claim they make a contribution to. However, the provision of jobs for the operation of a mine does not advance SDG number 8 because we're looking at ways to drive systemic change. This project from Fruta del Norte, a Lundin Gold project in Ecuador, I think is interesting because 2 people came to the company who had been working in the cafeteria and expressed their interest in establishing a catering company. Lundin Gold worked with their foundation to assess the market need because they didn't want to create a situation of dependency where the catering company was viable during the time of the mine's operation, but then had no additional revenue and was unsuccessful after. So they really wanted to find ways to look for post-mining business certainty in the region. The catering company was established, but when the company went out to do community roundtables, which they did on a regular basis, they heard from a number of people in the community who were unhappy. They said, sure, the catering company's got a good gig, but what about us? We're smallhold agricultural producers, and the company's buying all of its food and produce from Quito, the capital. This seemed like another opportunity. A market study was done, and once again, it was determined that there was capacity to build this economic development. And so the company worked in collaboration with the government and local universities to develop a program that now supports the supply chain of the original company. So this really does drive decent work and economic growth. So these ideas about creating shared value and advancing sustainable development are wonderful, but the Business and Sustainable Development Commission, in their report of a couple of years ago, noted that capturing the prize of sustainability and sustainable development can be hard. And one of the barriers are existing business models. And this is an area where I've been putting some research attention and giving some thought to this. It strikes me that society has changed very radically in the last 50 years, but the business model for mining really hasn't. And so, is there an opportunity there to see business models for sustainability? These would differ from the traditional business model of mining, which is very shareholder focused, to do three additional things, really to create value for society. That sounds like shared value. To protect and add value to the natural, social, and economic capital beyond a firm's organizational boundaries. So again, to create shared value. And the third thing that's an attribute of business models for sustainability is the need for collaborative partnerships. And so for all these reasons, I think there is a significant opportunity for mining companies to embrace the idea of business model change and innovation to build business models for sustainability. And in closing, I'd like to remind us of what Albert Einstein said. We can't solve problems using the same thinking that we use to create them. We can't advance the agenda of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals doing what we've always been doing. We need creativity and innovation. And that's why workshops and schools like ReSToRE are so important, because it brings together this amazing group of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary scholars, where we all work together to come up with collaborative and innovative solutions. It was a fascinating week at ReSToRE, and it fills me with a lot of opposition for what we might be able to do together to build both better business and a better world. Thank you.